It was a chilly afternoon in early spring when Hazel, a small, brown hedgehog, was brought into the clinic. Her small body was curled up into a tight ball, and she barely moved when I approached her cage. At first glance, she seemed like any other hedgehog I had treated before, quiet, nervous, and small. But as I examined her more closely, I could tell something was terribly wrong. I had worked as a veterinarian for many years, but the smallest of creatures, like hedgehogs, often hid their suffering behind the delicate armor of their spines. As I carefully uncurled Hazel to examine her, I noticed something that immediately concerned me. Her fur was patchy in places, and there were small, scabby spots all over her body. She seemed restless, as though she couldn't sit still, her tiny legs scratching furiously at her skin. It wasn't a typical reaction for a hedgehog to be this agitated. It was almost as though the sensation of something irritating her was driving her to madness. I carefully checked her over, looking for any obvious signs of injury or infection. And that's when I found them: ticks. Dozens of them. Small, blood-sucking parasites had burrowed themselves into Hazel's skin, their tiny bodies clinging to her like unwelcome intruders. They were scattered all over her back and legs, their presence causing her constant discomfort. It was heartbreaking to see such a small creature in so much distress. A hedgehog's natural instinct is to roll up into a tight ball when feeling threatened, but Hazel couldn't even find peace in that safe, familiar position. The ticks had made her life unbearable. I knew I had to act quickly. Ticks can transmit diseases that could be fatal to a hedgehog if not treated properly. They were not just a nuisance, they were a real threat to her health. I carefully began the process of removing each tick by hand. It wasn't a quick task. Each tick had to be removed with precision, and I had to make sure I didn't leave any parts of them behind, which could cause infection. As I worked, Hazel whimpered softly, her small body twitching as I carefully pulled each one off. I noticed that some of the ticks had already begun feeding, their bodies swollen with the blood they had taken from her. Hazel had been living with this infestation for some time, and I couldn't help but wonder how long she had been suffering in silence before someone noticed. Once I had removed the ticks, I gave her a thorough cleaning to prevent any possible infections. She was exhausted, too tired even to protest as I worked. I could see how much relief she had from no longer feeling the constant scratching and irritation. But the job wasn't done. The ticks were gone, but the damage they had done remained. I prescribed a series of medications to help Hazel recover. These medications would not only treat any infections caused by the ticks but would also boost her immune system, allowing her to heal. I also gave her a gentle bath to soothe her skin and recommended that she stay at the clinic for a few days to ensure she received the proper care and observation. As Hazel rested in her small enclosure, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for her well-being. This little hedgehog, who had been through so much, deserved a peaceful, healthy life. And I was determined to help her find that. The first night after Hazel's treatment, I watched her closely. She seemed to be resting more peacefully than before. Her tiny body, once tense and restless, now lay in a relaxed curl, her breathing slow and steady. I felt a sense of relief myself. Hazel's journey was far from over, but for the first time, she was free from the torment that had plagued her for so long. But the road to recovery wasn't always smooth. There were still challenges ahead, and Hazel's resilience would be tested in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Would her body heal from the damage? Would she trust again, after everything she had been through? I could only hope that the worst was behind her. The next morning, I would check on Hazel again, to see how she was progressing. But that day, Hazel had already taken her first step toward healing, by simply resting peacefully, unburdened by the constant irritation that had driven her mad. This was just the beginning. Hazel's recovery journey was far from simple, but with each passing day, she showed more and more signs of hope. And while the ticks were gone, the healing of her body and spirit would require much more than just medicine. But I knew that, with time and patience, Hazel would be able to curl up again, this time, happily, without the torment that had once taken over her tiny life. The days that followed Hazel's initial treatment were filled with small victories. She wasn't exactly lively at first, her tiny frame still bore the weight of the tick's damage, but she was at least comfortable. It was like watching a wounded animal learn to trust again, one cautious step at a time. I continued to check in on her every morning, each time finding her a little more alert, a little more curious. Hazel's journey to recovery wasn't just physical, it was emotional, too. The medication seemed to be working. Hazel's skin started to heal, and the scabs that had formed around the tick bites began to fade away. I had prepared her special meals to help her regain her strength, packed with nutrients that would support her healing. Slowly, she began to gain a little weight, her fur became a bit more even, and, most importantly, she wasn't scratching nearly as much. Her tiny legs still twitched at times, but it wasn't the frantic, uncontrollable scratching that had once dominated her every move. I remember one particular morning, about a week into her treatment, when I entered her enclosure and found something that almost brought tears to my eyes. Hazel was curled up in her little corner, but this time, she wasn't hunched over in discomfort. She was actually sleeping soundly, nestled into a soft bed of straw, her tiny body curled in a way that looked natural, like it should have been from the very beginning. It was a sign of progress. It was the first time I saw her truly at peace. As the days went on, I started to see little sparks of Hazel's personality again. She would poke her nose out from under her blanket of bedding when I entered the room, a curious glint in her dark eyes. Sometimes, she would roll into a ball and then quickly uncurl, as if testing her body's limits after weeks of discomfort. And every so often, I'd catch her stretching her legs and yawning, like she was remembering what it felt like to be comfortable in her own skin again. But it wasn't just the physical recovery that had me hopeful. It was the way she was beginning to trust me. I spent hours each day sitting by her cage, talking softly to her, just letting her get used to my presence. I never forced anything on her. I knew that, in time, she would come to understand that I wasn't a threat, but a helper. Someone who had taken away the pain and given her the chance to rest and heal. Eventually, Hazel began to show interest in the world beyond her enclosure. At first, she was cautious. When I would open the door to her cage, she would cautiously poke her nose out, testing the air, as if unsure whether the outside world was safe. But after a while, her natural curiosity took over. She would venture out, her small feet making tiny scurrying noises as she explored the surrounding space. She wasn't running around wildly, but she was moving, something I hadn't seen in her for a long time. It wasn't long before Hazel's movements became more purposeful. She started to explore the clinic, cautiously sniffing at the corners, gently poking her nose into the soft bedding I had placed around her enclosure. One morning, when I opened the door to check on her, I was greeted not by a frightened, hunched ball, but by a small hedgehog waddling towards me. She paused, her eyes meeting mine as if she were asking, "Is it safe?" I knelt down to her level, offering her my hand. She hesitated, taking a step back, but then, to my surprise, she slowly came forward and nudged my fingers with her tiny nose. It was a moment that felt like a victory. I had earned her trust. The recovery process was not without its setbacks, of course. There were days when Hazel would seem more tired than usual, or when she would scratch a little more than I liked. It was clear that the emotional trauma of the infestation had left its mark on her. Some nights, she would still curl up tightly, almost as if she were protecting herself from some invisible threat. But that was okay. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was a journey, and I was here, ready to guide her every step of the way. By the end of the month, Hazel was a different hedgehog altogether. Her fur had grown back in full, soft and smooth. The scabs on her skin had disappeared, and her small, shiny eyes were full of curiosity again. I even noticed that she was eating well, her appetite returning to normal, which was a great sign of recovery. And then came the day I had been waiting for, the day when Hazel was ready to leave the clinic and return to the wild. I had prepared a small carrier for her, carefully placing fresh bedding and food inside. I had monitored her progress, and I knew that she was strong enough to survive on her own now. But as I opened the door to let her out into the carrier, I felt a mix of emotions. I was proud of how far she had come, but I also felt a sense of attachment. I had watched this tiny hedgehog fight through so much. I had witnessed her healing process from start to finish, and now it was time for her to take the next step in her life. Hazel paused for a moment at the entrance of the carrier, looking back at me. Her tiny eyes seemed to say, "Thank you." And then, with one final, determined step, she waddled inside, curling up contentedly in the soft bedding I had provided. She looked peaceful, ready to begin her new chapter, free from the ticks and the torment they had caused her. I watched her for a moment longer before gently closing the carrier and setting it outside the clinic. I had prepared a small area near a safe patch of forest, one I knew was filled with places for Hazel to burrow and find shelter. It was perfect, a place where she could start fresh. When I opened the carrier, Hazel didn't hesitate. She immediately scurried out, her tiny feet moving swiftly as she disappeared into the underbrush, her little form vanishing among the leaves. And in that moment, I knew that Hazel had made it. She was no longer the suffering hedgehog who had come into the clinic weeks ago. She was strong, healthy, and free. I couldn't help but smile, knowing that this small creature had found her way back to herself. It wasn't just about curing the ticks, it was about giving Hazel the chance to live the life she deserved. The rest of her journey, whatever it may be, was now in her own tiny paws. And with that, I watched Hazel disappear into the world, a small but determined creature, finally at peace.